So I wanted to make a quick tip video on diagnosing this Mercedes Benz code 970, also called a P0452 generic code. It's low voltage or low input for this, which is your fuel tank pressure sensor, which is underneath your back seat. More appropriately, it's in your fuel tank, but luckily Mercedes Benz gave us quick access to this. So you can see that I have a ground wire hooked up here to the battery ground just for testing purposes. Obviously, you want to make sure that you have high resistance to ground on all three of, not all three. You want to have high resistance to ground on your signal wire, which is your red wire, and your signal wire, which is your middle gray purple wire. But low resistance to ground on your brown and blue, or brown and gray wire, your third wire, your ground. Obviously you should have low resistance to ground on your ground wire, but high resistance to ground on your voltage and your signal wire. So as you can see here with this plugged in, another basic check. This is a 5-volt reference here, so you should see 5 volts on this wire here. If that's 5 volts and you have low resistance to ground on your ground wire, and then make sure when you're checking grounds, you check with the key off always. Everything has to be powered down when you're checking resistances, or you'll get false readings. And then while you're powered down, go ahead and check resistance against each wire to each other as well, to make sure we don't have a short somewhere in the harness where one wire is shorted to another wire. It seems unlikely, but I've seen it happen. You'll see here that we have a reading of 0 volts and negative 0.5 psi while it's plugged into the sensor. This is key on, obviously. And when I unplug it, I immediately go to 5 volts, 0.52 psi. So, plugged in, again, 0 volts, 0.58 psi. Unplugged, 5 volts, 0.52 psi. In troubleshooting heavy-duty diesel electronics, they do not give you ohm resistance readings for sensors anymore. That is a dead way, an outdated way of testing whether a sensor's bad. There are rare instances with like an ABS sensor or something. Rarely a manufacturer will give an ohm resistance reading to tell whether or not a sensor is malfunctioning. So what we do instead is we jump and we check for ECM response. So if you jump your 5-volt reference to your signal wire, in most instances you'll see 5 volts, or you'll get a high voltage code. If you jump your signal wire to ground, you'll get low voltage back to the ECM, and it will throw a low volt code. You can also just watch the voltages to verify this. Some cars behave a little differently, but that's the basic nuts and bolts there, so to speak. If you do have this plugged in and you're back probing, and in this case I'm actually using the correct terminals to front probe this. Do not front probe this with anything other than the correct terminals, or you'll spread them and damage them and cause more problems for yourself than you had in the first place. Nothing like chasing your tail over something that you created in the process of diagnosing. It does happen. To the untrained, I should say. So I pop this little guy off here. I'm trying to do this with one hand. There's just 2 little tabs, and then it pulls out the front. This protects the terminals and holds them in place at the same time. And then while we're watching, we're going to go ahead and jump our 5-volt reference to signal. and we should have 5 volts, and we do. Now we're gonna jump our signal to ground. You see our voltage and our pressure went low. If our signal jumped to ground is giving the same reading as it is when it's plugged in to the sensor, you know your sensor's bad. Your sensor's completely shorted. Plugging this into the sensor is essentially doing the same thing as me jumping the signal wire directly to ground in the sensor itself. Don't plug this in, by the way, without this protector on like I just did. You can foobar things. I'm being careful, and I'm a trained professional. Also, if you're back probing, things are going to be different if this is plugged in. Bear in mind, if you're back probe checking, your voltage checks will be different. And if you're jumping to ground, you would jump 5 volts to ground over the signal, and that will essentially give you the same thing as a short to ground, because you'll read 0 volts. Your 5 volts will be going directly to ground, and there will be nothing left for the ECM to read on the signal wire. We know we have a bad sensor here. Hope that helps somebody.